Coming up next, BookTV presents Afterwards, an hour-long program where we invite guest hosts to interview authors. This week, former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and his new book, On China. The diplomat who accompanied President Nixon to the communist nation presents his thoughts on the history of China's relationship with the United States and its current influence on American politics and monetary policy. He shares his perspective with former Nixon aide and Fox News contributor Monica Crowley.
Dr. Kissinger, great to see you, sir.
Always
As
a
always.
pleasure to see you.
So nice to see you, and congratulations on your extraordinary new book, which is called, quite simply, On China. And I can't think of anybody else I'd rather talk to about China. China has gone over the last few decades from being a very important concern for the United States to an important, urgent, and primary concern for the United States. And there are so many layers to the Sino-American relationship, and we're going to get into it all with you. So thank you for being here, sir.
Look forward to it.
Let's begin with how China sees itself and how it's traditionally seen itself. As I was making my way through your book, you write that both the United States and China believe that they represent unique values in the world. And you say that the United States believes it has an obligation to spread its values to every part of the world, whereas China acts on the basis of its singularity, and that it's expanded through what you call cultural osmosis. Tell us what you mean.
America believes that its values apply everywhere, that any society can adopt them, that our institutions can be spread everywhere. The Chinese believe that they represent a unique civilization. You can't really become a Chinese. You have to grow up in its cultural environment. You can't really naturalize as a Chinese. So, as a result, Americans have thought of the world as composed of more or less equal societies and had a concept of sovereignty to go with it. The Chinese, until the end of the 19th century, thought of the world as tributaries to what they called the Celestial Empire. Tributaries didn't mean that they had to pay tribute. They had to bring, it was expected that they'd bring symbolic gifts, but they were often given bigger gifts in return. But what it did mean is that they indicated respect for the nature of Chinese society and Chinese supremacy in its region. So Chinese relations with other nations are based more on mutual respect than on a concept of equality. But the Chinese, as we do, believe that their values are unique, and it makes them even more sensitive than we would be to outside pressures telling them how to redo their society.
Is it a superiority? Do the Chinese, when you say that they believe their
values
values are
superiority.
unique?
It's not necessarily a sense of personal superiority.
Right. You also write that when Europe entered the modern age, it had a tremendous experience with diversity by then. And you had these princes and counts, you had cities across Europe that governed themselves, and you had an entire political philosophy built on that concept. That's
right.
Liberalization, right? You also say that when China entered the modern age, it had been a fully functioning imperial bureaucracy for over 1,000 years. Tell us what you mean about imperial bureaucracy.
China, the modern China, evolved actually about 2,000 years ago. And when China was unified, and then it was governed by a bureaucracy that was elected by competitive examinations. So in that sense, it was more modern than Europe was at that period. And we, of course, didn't exist. But China had a governing philosophy, which was Confucianism, and a governing bureaucracy, which operated on a national basis, and therefore when occasionally China was conquered by its neighbors, but they didn't know how to govern it, and they needed the Chinese bureaucracy. So on at least two occasions in Chinese history, foreigners came in, conquered the country, used the Chinese bureaucracy to govern it, and became Sinified themselves. So China expanded sometimes by the opposite of Western ways, not by conquest, but by being conquered and then Sinifying the conquerors. The Mongols in one occasion, and the Manchus from the north in another.
It's a much more efficient way, isn't it?
You also say, painful way.
It is, yes. You also say that because China was never really forced to engage with larger civilizations in the world, it remained basically insular. But because of that, it also considered itself the center of the world. Well, does that still hold true?
In a way, it still held true when Nixon and I went to China. The conduct of Mao and the first revolutionary leaders in China still was subconsciously influenced by the Chinese patterns. For example, you never had an appointment with Mao. You were summoned to see Mao, and that was also the same of any foreign envoy that came for the previous millennium. There was a British, at the end of the 18th century, the British sent an envoy to Beijing, and he was supposed to offer them trade and diplomatic relations and everything that Europeans were familiar with. He was marvelously received, but he couldn't get an audience with the emperor, and it took him 3 months before he was summoned. And then they said, you have nothing we want, and we have nothing you should want. Therefore, trade is not possible, and we don't receive ambassadors because anyone who lives in Beijing has to wear Chinese clothes, live in a Chinese house, and can never leave China. So now your question is, do they still think this way? Mm-hmm. Of course not that's exactly this way, but and with globalization of the economy and with daily contact, but there's still a tendency to think in Central Kingdom terms, though it's much attenuated in the modern period.
You mentioned Mao Zedong, of course, the father of the Chinese Communist Revolution. You knew him? You worked with him? Or you spoke with him in the early 70s?
I met him 5 times, 3 times alone.
What were your impressions of him, both as a strategic leader and as a movement leader?
Well, first, as a movement leader, one has to understand that the tens of millions of people were killed under his rule. And the reason for that was, in part, because he wanted to complete the communist revolution in his lifetime. He knew that in Chinese history, the leader he respected most was an emperor who unified China. And then, 20 years after his death, all vestiges of his rule had disappeared except the unification. So he, for example, organized what's called the Great Leap Forward, in which China was supposed to move from total underdevelopment to a steel production at the level of Great Britain in 3 years. And in order to do that, they had to get resources from the countryside, and they melted down all steel implements. The result was a famine in which as many as 40 million people may have been killed. Then 10 years later, he started the Cultural Revolution, which was another